page 404 of the United Methodist Hymnal, and in the Songs of Zion, page 121, we sing this. Every time I feel the Spirit moving in my heart, I will pray. Every time I feel the Spirit moving in my heart, I will pray. Upon the mountain, my Lord spoke. Out of his mouth came fire and smoke. All around me looked so shine. Asked my Lord if all was mine. Every time I feel the Spirit explores the powerful combination of spirit and prayer, as indicated in the key words of the refrain. African-American scholar W.E.B. Du Bois, born 1868, died 1963, ascribes three gifts from the African-American community that mingle with the others who occupy the land now called the United States of America. The first is the gift of story and song. The second is the gift of sweat and brawn to beat back the wilderness, conquer the soil, and lay the foundations of this vast economic empire. The third gift is the gift of the Spirit. The following witness indicates that the Spirit imbued enslaved Africans with both joy and deliverance, endurance for the day. In slavery times, my master whipped me terribly, especially when he knew I was praying. He was determined to whip the Spirit out of me, but he never could. For the more he whipped me, the more the Spirit made me happy. Name unknown. Name unknown. For the African-American slave, Spirit-filled worship could be ecstatic. Words of an old spiritual describe worship in the Spirit. Going to have a happy meeting. Going to shout to heaven. Going to shout and never tire. Slap your hands, chillins. Oh, pat your feet, chillins. I feel the Spirit moving. And now I'm getting happy. Circa 1909. The refrain may find its biblical roots in the outpouring of the Spirit at Pentecost in Acts chapter 2. Or it could be an extension of Paul's understanding of the Spirit in Romans chapter 8, verse 26. Likewise, the Spirit also helpeth our infirmities, for we know not what we should pray for as we ought, but the Spirit itself maketh intercession for us with groanings which cannot be uttered, from the King James Version. William McCain's commentaries translate the biblical context into an African-American understanding. This widely known spiritual describes the power and the energy released in black devotion to the God of emotion. Black people have never had any concept of a God who could not be felt. It is this feeling of the Spirit that renders the black religious experience incomparable to any others. McCain, 1990. The spirituals not only speak of prayer, but often are prayers. It's me, it's me, it's me, O Lord, standing in the need of prayer. Identifies each and every one of our need for prayer. Lord, I want to be a Christian in my heart, is a prayer of contrition and holiness. African-American activist and children's advocate Marion Wright Edelman, born 1939, affirms the role of prayer in this way. We black children were wrapped up and rocked in the cradle of faith, song, prayer, ritual, and worship, which immunized our spirits against some of the meanness and unfairness inflicted on our young psyches by racial discrimination and poverty in our segregated South and our acquiescent nation. Song prayer is a way of surviving. The roots of the spiritual may be found in the antebellum South. One often cited report indicates that Abraham Lincoln heard a group of escaped slaves led by Aunt Mary Dinas singing the spiritual, among others, during one of his visits to the contraband camp at the 7th Street in Washington, D.C. Contraband camps were areas where escaped enslaved people lived. The description notes that Lincoln sang with the group as they were singing for him. Not all accounts include this spiritual with those that were said to have been sung on this occasion, but many do. Carl Dahl Jr. suggests that the images and allusions in the stanzas were floating themes that might appear in other spirituals The stanzas were, for the most part, standardized as early as 1909 in Thomas Fenner's groundbreaking religious folk songs of the Negro as sung on the plantations, published while he taught at the Hampton Institute, now Hampton University in Virginia. In allusion to Moses on Mount Sinai, undergirds stanza 1, noting that all gleaned from that height. In stanza 2, the singer seems to join Moses on the heights of Pisgah to view the promised land. Spirituals and gospel hymns are replete with references to the Jordan River. For the enslaved African, the Jordan could be the place of physical freedom, the north, or the liminal spiritual space between this life and heaven. Numerous biblical references to the Jordan River, including one from Numbers, link the Jordan to the promised land. In addition, Matthew's gospel records that Jesus received the Spirit in his baptism in the Jordan River. Upon the mount my Lord spoke. Out of his mouth came fire and smoke. See Exodus 19, verse 18. All around me looks so shine. Ask my Lord if all was mine. See Deuteronomy 34, verses 1 through 4. Jordan River is chilly and cold. Chills the body, but not the soul. Reference Numbers 35, verses 9 through 11. And Matthew 3, verses 13 through 17. Take time and go back and look these up. Read these as you recite these verses again, to hear the words from the Word and in the words of the gospel song. These stanzas were repeated in dialectic in American Negro Spirituals from 1925 with a concertized solo arrangement by J. Rosamond Johnson. Generally, hymnals conflagrate stanzas 1 and 2 above into a single first stanza. To the third stanza, Jordan River, a couplet rounds out the second half of stanza 2, and the train reference is common in many spirituals. This was the mode of transportation to freedom, be it the metaphorical Underground Railroad to the north or the direct line to freedom beyond this life. Ain't but one train on this track runs to heaven and right back. An unattributed third unique stanza appears in the Chalice Hymnal of 1995. I have heartache, I have woe, I have trouble here below. While God leads me, I'll not fear, I am sheltered by God's care. Theologian James Cone captures the spiritual importance of the African American community when he says this: to interpret the theological significance of this spiritual for the black community, academic tools are not enough. The interpreter must feel the Spirit. That is, he must feel his way into the power of black music, responding both to its rhythm and the faith and experience it affirms. This song invites the believer to move close to the very sources of black being and to experience the black community's power to endure, the will to survive. The mountains may be high and the valleys low, but my Lord spoke, and out of his mouth came fire and smoke. All the believer has to do is to respond to the divine apocalyptic discourse of God's revelation and cry, have mercy on me, please. Every Time I Feel the Spirit does not appear to have been a part of the famous Fisk Jubilee Singers publications or concert repertoire at the end of the 19th century, but it may have made its way into their repertoire through the Hampton Institute publications, quartet concerts, and recordings in the early 20th century. Like the Fisk Jubilee Singers, Hampton sent out choirs and quartets to sing spirituals and raise funds to support the struggling institution. Ethnomusicologist Natalie Curtis Berlin, 1875 to 1921, made recordings during visits to Hampton between 1915 and 1970, where eminent African-Canadian Nathaniel Dett was the composer and teacher. The, quote, first quartet, one of several, recorded a number of spirituals, works, and play songs on a cylinder phonograph for her research. And one of the spirituals recorded was Every Time I Feel the Spirit, which is an indication of its wide acceptance. Berlin's transcription of the male quartet arrangement has been preserved. Where Fenner offers a bare bones version in standard English, that barely takes half a page. Dent's version, recorded less than a decade later by Berlin, is a fully concertized arrangement in dialectic. Berlin's note assiduously names of the original male quartet. Berlin notes assiduously the names of the original male quartets, their voices, parts, and majors, and then follows with this most interesting note. Of all the spirituals, this is one of the most touching in its prayerful suggestion and quiet reverence, and in the poetic mastery of its verse. Couched in a few crude words, elemental in their simplicity, yet somehow conveying the grandeur of the vision of God on the mountaintop and the dazed soul beholding heaven. As was the custom in concerts of this area, the text follows in dialectic. The tempo indication is slowly with a pulse of just 50 beats a minute. By the time that Tuskegee Institute musician William Dawson published his famous choral arrangement in 1946, the tempo indications more than doubled to 120 beats per minute. Dawson's arrangement has held sway as the norm for interpreting the spiritual. The Hampton Institute recording places the emphasis on prayer. Dawson and most subsequent renditions place the emphasis on spirit. The spiritual crossed over to the white evangelical community earlier in the 20th century in publications such as Gems of Love, and then in Plantation Melodies and Spiritual Songs from 1927. It was included in more collections in the 50s and in the 60s, and during the 80s it entered the canon of spirituals found in virtually all African American collections, and then more broadly. Songs of Zion, a part of the United Methodist hymnology, has an unembellished diatonic harmonizing version on the refrain, with unison and solos unharmonized stanzas, very similar to Fenner's solo unharmonized stanzas from 1909. But by contrast, in the United Methodist hymnal, employs the quasi-concertized harmonies of William Farley Smith, with their chromatic interparts and the slightly extended cadational progressions. As one author notes, this is one of the most thrilling of the later Jubilee songs. It is much used for taking up collections in the church. The range of interpretations of the spiritual is broad. Returning to the initial assertion by W.E.B. Du Bois concerning the gifts of the Spirit from the African American community to all of the United States, the following slave narrative, while bearing a specific poignancy in its context, is a witness that might be told by many. I felt awful when I first got to church and took my place in the stand, waiting for the congregation to gather. And the Spirit lifted me up. I forgot all about the pain and just lost sight of the world and all the things of this world. When the Spirit begins to work with me, I don't have any cares for pain and anything of the world. We rejoice because the Spirit makes us feel so good and forget all worldly cares. Name unknown. Every time I feel the Spirit moving in my heart, I will pray. Every time I feel the Spirit moving in my heart, I will pray.
Hey guys, thanks for tuning in and listening to all these devotions based around the great hymns of faith. A lot of the information that you're hearing is drawn from the General Board of Discipleship website of the United Methodist Church. You can go to that to gbod.org and just write in the name of the hymn if you want to know more about it, and it'll pop up a thing that says History of Hymns. They have a whole series on there that you might find interesting. If we don't cover this month one of the hymns that you would like to hear, we'd encourage you to go to that site and read along. Thanks.